Hello everyone, I'm Michele Dillon, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts here at the University of New Hampshire. Much of my research has focused on Catholicism, and so I'm happy to share with you some thoughts on the recent passing of Pope Francis and what to anticipate from the upcoming conclave to elect his successor. The Pope's significance and impact extends far beyond Catholics, of course, and that is why flags have been flying at half staff at public buildings and sites, including on our beautiful campus, as a mark of respect. Key to understanding Francis's papacy is his view, which he expressed in a lengthy interview early on in his pontificate, that God dwells in secular society. This is a deeply held Catholic belief that the sacred is to be found in ordinary everyday experiences and activities. But in recent decades, Francis' immediate predecessors, especially Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, tended to take a very critical and defensive view of the secular world. So for Francis to explicitly state that God is to be encountered in today's world marked, especially for many Catholics, most of whom live in secular context, a refreshing affirmation. And relatedly, he frequently emphasized that realities are more important than ideas. There has to be continuous dialogue, as he frequently said, between the two, lest ideas become detached from realities. And where we really see this in action was his very highly pastoral approach to looking at the family lives and the personal relationships of ordinary Catholics. So many of you ask, what is Francis's legacy? And it's a very hard question to answer because he really does have a multi-pronged legacy. But one does have to highlight the pastoral approach that he brought to these, complex issues for many Catholics, and certainly for many American Catholics and Western Catholics and Catholics in South America, where issues of sexual morality have been controversial and of major concern to them for several decades. And so what we've seen happen during Francis' papacy, with a lot of input from lay people, a lot of data gathering all across the world about the lives, the family lives and relationships of ordinary Catholics, about how they live, is trying to have an approach that, as Francis would often say, that we have to accompany people. We have to know their realities, understand their realities, and walk with them, be with them as they deal with the particular circumstances of their lives. And so with some of the changes made in regard to sexual relationships outside of marriage, both same-sex relationships, cohabiting relationships, and people who are divorced and remarried without a church annulment, Francis was very much open for the church to discern pastorally inclusive ways in which they can be included in the life, the full sacramental life of the church. This is a view, of course, and a change in positioning, if you will, a change in the pastoral inclusion attitude of many bishops and priests who agree with this, but not everyone does. And so this is, of course, is part of Francis's legacy, but it's also one of the issues that drives some of the contention and polarization in the church. But there's quite a lot of division about it, but nonetheless, senior cardinals, including Cardinal McEnroy, who was recently appointed Archbishop of Washington, D.C., a year or two ago, he talked about the need to develop a new theology of sex and sin, one that recognizes that sexual life is an important part of Catholics' lives, of everyone's lives, and that the church for too long, in a sense, has made that the primary focus of its gospel activity and its missionary outreach, rather than really trying to recognize that many Catholics are doing their best to live good lives and that there's a lot of value in relationships, even if they don't have full approval of the Catholic Church. Another very, I think, significant element of Francis's legacy that will last for many years, even if there will certainly perhaps be some pause in its momentum, is his efforts to reform the church governance, largely the Vatican, the Curia, that's the large concentrated set of offices that run the church set in the Vatican. He did a lot to reform some of how these departments are run. But he also, time and again, often at his Christmas message to church officials, which probably wasn't the nicest time to say all this, but he challenged them and called out their narcissism, called out the culture of clericalism, which is a very deeply embedded culture across the Catholic Church, no matter what country in the world you focus on, and to remind priests and bishops and cardinals that they're here to serve the people of God, that the church is the people of God, and that they're in our service rather than we, in a sense, serving them. So, of course, that's a lot of lay people are very happy to hear those words, but of course at the same time it causes some negative opinion within church officials and among church officials themselves. Francis also, as part of church governance, elevated women, mostly nuns, religious sisters, to senior positions in some of the Vatican offices, even as, of course, he has been very insistent about opposition to women's ordination, very much in continuity here with Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, and the teaching of the Church, which has been addressing this at least since Pope Paul VI's papacy. And beyond Catholics and the immediate issues for Catholics, I would say a major component of his legacy that will last for many decades to come is his coupling of climate change and poverty as an urgent global issue. The church for a long time, of course, has talked about poverty going back to its early teachings from the late 19th century on what we call its social justice tradition. And many popes, including Pope Benedict, for example, Paul VI as well, talked about climate change and why it is that we have to do things to help improve and mitigate the negative effects on climate degradation. But Francis really made this a major signature of his papacy, and in particular linked the negative effects of climate change to how it also exacerbates poverty and all of the problems that people living in poor communities and poor individuals encounter. As he said, and I quote this from his major encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, Care for Our Common Home, we are faced not with two separate crises, one environmental and the one social, but rather with one complex crisis that is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time protecting nature. And so that's really captures in a nutshell what really is long-term Catholic social justice teaching, but really has had a lot of influence not only among certain Catholics, but also with the world at large. And, Francis has really become a moral leader, or did become a moral leader, and his legacy in this domain of climate change and looking at the global issue and the set of issues that it presents. He was very much his words, and he himself participated in UN global summits on climate, and his words, I think, and leadership on this issue were very significant during his papacy and will continue to make a big difference going forward. So now that we know what his legacy is, many people ask, is the conclave stacked in favor of a continuation of Francis' priorities, given the fact that Francis himself is responsible for having appointed 4/5 of the cardinals who will actually be voting on his successor when it starts on May 7th? Well, the short answer to this is that no, not necessarily, because there are a lot of uncertainties. So even though Francis has appointed many of these cardinals, and we can assume that he appointed them because they captured a lot of the aspects of what he believes a good cardinal, a good shepherd should be for the flock, people change as they go through their positions. And at the conclave meetings, which have been happening, some of them informally, some of them formal congregations since Pope Francis died, once the various cardinals from around the world managed to get to Rome, they've been getting to know each other. They've had lots of time, to know each other, to get to know each other better. Some of them know each other fairly well from having, either from the same country, like some of the US cardinals obviously know each other very well. But lots of cardinals don't know each other. And one of the fascinating things about Francis's papacy is the number of cardinals whom he appointed from countries that in the past were not very well represented, or not represented at all in the Vatican. And so they have a much greater geographical diversity, as you can see here, with cardinals from Africa and from Asia. Of course, the European cardinals and the North American cardinals as a group are the dominant groups, and the Italians, of course, in particular. But nonetheless, you see a much greater distribution of cardinals from what Francis himself would call the peripheries, countries that oftentimes, even though they've long been part of the universal church and of global Catholicism, have not had much recognition or affirmation in the church in terms of having high status. And so the outcomes are uncertain, because as the cardinals get to know each other, they take the measure of each one, they get to know each other's personalities, get to learn something about their backgrounds, their experiences, and the kinds of things that they feel are important, right, on the various issues. Because during these congregational meetings that have been going on in Rome, the cardinals are discussing and getting updates on various aspects of the church, its finances, for example, as well as also talking about all of the hot button issues, whether it's issues of sexual morality, the role of women in the church, the role of laity in the church, and then, of course, the very pressing and urgent set of geopolitical issues that we are confronting really these last few months and for several years, but we really are, there's some accentuated crisis, as you know. And so the cardinals are discussing all of these issues, and as they're having these discussions, they're listening to one another, they're taking what other people say seriously, and that helps people to not necessarily make up their mind, because hopefully they're not making up their minds yet, but that they're listening, they're reaching out, and they're hearing a broad swath of opinion on the numerous issues. And so as a result of all of this conversing with one another and just hanging out together during the pre-conclave meetings, you're going to find that some will form new factions who maybe didn't even know that they had much in common with some of the other cardinals. It might consolidate certain other groups or alliances that long were seen, whether on issues of doctrine, for example, or on issues whether it's got to do with, as I say, sexual morality doctrines, or whether it's got to do with some of the top social justice issues, migration, the wars that are happening. You might find that people themselves are surprised, the bishops, the cardinals there, that they actually feel affinities in directions that they didn't necessarily feel that was part of their lives. And so there's a lot of uncertainty, even though, of course, at the same time, the fact that Pope Francis appointed so many of those people who will be now voting on his successor, that would certainly have to have an impact. But nonetheless, there's a lot of emergent dynamism that happens during these weeks, and then once we get to the actual election process in the Sistine Chapel. So what characteristics, people ask, will the cardinals be looking for in the next pope? And again, there's a lot of things that one can highlight. Certainly, I would say a strong pastoral sensibility, because the church, first and foremost, is a religious, spiritual organization. It really has to cater, it has to understand the spiritual needs of its flock. Francis certainly embodied that remarkably well. But I think no matter who is chosen as the next pope, I think there's a renewed attention that we have to have someone who has that pastoral sensibility and hopefully pastoral experience, extensive pastoral experience. But also because the church is a large multinational corporation, they also need a pope who has strong administrative, executive competence, who understands finances. Another topic for people to be having on their mind as they're looking at what to expect is openness to balancing the pressures from the laity for more inclusion in church governance and giving input on all kinds of issues in the church, something which Francis certainly opened up. But a lot of church officials themselves, while some certainly agree with this, there's others who really feel that certain roles in the church, including heads of departments within the Vatican and certain other, assistant roles, we're not talking about sacramental roles here, we're not talking about women being priests, we're talking about women running various departments, for example, within the Vatican. Some high-level bishops and cardinals oppose that. So that'll be attention sort of more in sort of the intra-work of the Vatican that some will be certainly paying attention to. I also have here alertness to the continuing urgency of safeguarding, of ensuring the safeguarding of children from sexual abuse. The implications of clerical sex abuse continue to become known. Some countries have not really dealt with those issues in the way that many have, such as the US, for example. But that's something that whoever is chosen, I think all of the cardinals will be looking to make sure that that person really does fully understand the breadth and depth of that problem and its multi-layered ripples, which are still continue to be serious for the victims as well as for the credibility of the church, both spiritually and pastorally. There also needs to be a really deep appreciation that the church truly is a universal global church. It's always been a global church, but as I noticed with that map showing where the cardinals are from, that gives voice to the fact that it really is a global church. It's not a Eurocentric church, it's not a northern church. And the person who is chosen really needs to hopefully have some background of living there. He doesn't necessarily have to come and be born in one of the countries, let's say, from another Latin American pope, for example, or from Africa or Asia, but certainly to have spent time working in some of those regions, and of course to be multilingual, given the globalization of Catholicism and given the fact that it is a global organization. Many of the cardinals, of course, and many bishops even speak many languages. That, of course, goes with part and parcel of being a global organization. And then, of course, extremely important at all times, really, but particularly in the current moment, is strong commitment to the church's geopolitical leadership, because the Pope is also a head of state. It's head of the Holy See, the Vatican, and as we know, plays a hugely significant role as a diplomat, much of the time behind the scenes, and that's always been the case, but across all kinds of geopolitical tensions and issues. So that's a lot of characteristics. So just like with a lot of job descriptions, it's hard necessarily to find all of these as standing out in any one person, but that's what certainly the cardinals will be looking at and for. Many of you ask which direction for the church. Of course, that's sort of the $1 million question. And I love this question in many ways, even though it's a very hard question to answer, because it allows me to say, I think, that when people ask what direction for the church, often they accompany that question by asking, will it continue to embrace change? Will it roll back some of the changes of Francis? And basically, I would argue there's no going back, because what has happened, whether it's Francis's inclusion of laity in certain positions and in various conversations. No matter what it is, it now is really part and part of the official piece of Catholicism. And the same with the teachings, whether, the discussion, for example, of the pathway to communion, to Holy Communion for divorced and remarried Catholics, that's now in the church record. And so even if the next Pope doesn't talk about that or tries to make it more circumspect, nonetheless, the cat is out of the bag. Catholics know that the Pope himself and many top church officials believe that the whole world of sexual morality needs to be assessed. It's not to have an anything goes morality, but to recognize that there's many Catholics who are living in situations that are not officially approved by the church, but who long for greater sacramental integration into the life of the church, being able to go to Mass and attend communion. So that's now part and parcel really of the church, and that's not going to change, even though some of the momentum towards some of these changes gets paused or slows down for a number of years. There's always continuities and discontinuities in Catholicism. I say, Catholicism is a living tradition. It's not, there's a deposit of faith, there's the core beliefs that Catholics have about, which are the principles of the gospel, the birth, life, and resurrection, death and resurrection of Jesus. But there's a lot within Catholicism, within Catholic theology, within Catholic liturgical practices, within Catholic social teaching, within Catholic doctrine at large. That's nuanced, there's ambiguities, and it's a living tradition, precisely because the Catholic Church and Catholicism as a religion must engage and sees itself as engaging with the world, with the secular world, with the world as it changes. And so there'll always be continuities and discontinuities. And I think that's something to keep in mind. It's not either or. And that too is a very Catholic position. It's always the and. It's the continuities and discontinuities. It's of course tradition, but also tradition in conversation with change. So tradition and change go together. And so which direction, it'll always be moving forward. It can't go back. But even as it moves forward, there will continue to be contentiousness and ambiguities. But that really is part and parcel of what it means to be Catholic. Amid global challenges, some ask, how might the church adjust its priorities? And frankly, I would say the church doesn't need to adjust its priorities. It really must, though, continue its long-standing commitment to articulating its teaching and its core teaching on the inherent dignity of each and every person. That's been at the core of Catholic social justice teaching since at least the latter part of the 19th century. Its emphasis on social justice, on a living wage, on people being able to have a good life, to be able to participate fully in the life of their community, to have access to healthcare, to have access to education, and so to respect life at all stages. And if the church continues its long-standing emphasis on this, then that ultimately is all it can do. Now, of course, it has to have the courage to bring those principles particularly into all aspects of its leadership, but certainly, given the current crisis globally, into geopolitical leadership and its diplomacy efforts, notwithstanding the many sources of opposition to the Vatican's interventions or behind the scenes trying to bring people together. So, by definition, I think the Catholic Church has to always be offending somebody, whether it's within the church or beyond the church, because its teachings don't follow along lines that we normally think about in terms of political context, right? Its continuum of life means that it has a very particular position on abortion, opposition to abortion, but also opposition to the death penalty, respect for a living wage, as I say, and access to the social goods of society, care for the environment. So from a political perspective, certainly within the context of the US, Catholic social teaching does not align at all, either directly with Republican Party politics or with Democratic Party politics. And that's the same across most democracies where there are political parties. The Catholic Church's teachings transcend partisanship, transcend politics. And so its moral voice is always going to be offending somebody. And it's the same with its diplomacy and with its diplomatic efforts, particularly in the context of war. Given its commitment to the life of everybody, to the dignity of everybody, it's understandable that there are some tensions with the church's position with regard to Ukraine and Russia, with regard to what's happening in the Middle East, and no matter what, with regard to China. So every region that you look at, the Catholic Church will always be looking for peace and respect for the dignity of all involved. And that's a complicated stance to argue, even as church teaching also recognizes that there can be a just war. It all the time is seeking peace, peace on earth. That was the title of one of John the 23rd's encyclicals, and it continues to inform every pope since then, and will, I believe, and should certainly be a top priority for the next pope. Finally, let me say a couple of words about Conclave, the movie that many of you have seen. It's a wonderful movie, a lot of great drama, beautiful, of course. Any movie set in the Vatican and Rome is always compelling, in my view. Certainly, I think it got a lot right. Of course, I should give full disclosure. I've never been to a conclave, and I never will. Very few people have. But I think from what we know from secondhand accounts, certainly the talk of secrecy, the importance of secrecy, the way the cardinals are sequestered, conclave with key, they're locked in, they're kept away from the rest of the world. There's no external influences allowed. These days, that means, of course, no electronic devices, no cell phones, no computers. The Sistine Chapel has been swept to make sure that there are no little bugs hidden anywhere. I think also the movie got right, more or less the ballot process, the number of times the people vote, the ritual of what they say as they're voting, the words that they say, the counting of votes and the checking of votes. Much of that, I think, certainly is correct. But some of the details and perhaps some of the melodrama and extra dramatic high points in the movie are a little out of sync with the reality of the church. For example, when there's no secretly appointed cardinals can participate. There can be secretly appointed cardinals for political reasons, but you can't just show up on the day and participate in the conclave. It only allows all publicly appointed cardinals who have already been in the public eye and that everyone knows are cardinals from the consistory that the Pope has done. Also, as we saw in the movie, when our nun talked and shared some of her personal life with the Dean of Cardinals, he then used that information to discredit one of the competitors for the role of Pope. That is totally a violation of the seal of the sacrament of confession, and certainly that is a major grave sin in Catholic teaching, is also against canon law. And the final point is, and this is directly from Cardinal O'Malley, who did serve as Archbishop of Boston until very recently, and who has been very active. He was on the Cardinal, he was part of his kitchen cabinet, if you will, of Pope Francis, but also participated in the conclave that elected Francis. In his blog a few months ago, he basically said that there would be a much more spiritual and prayerful atmosphere in the Sistine Chapel during the voting process than was portrayed. And that, of course, makes sense because all of the politicking happens prior to actually going into the Sistine Chapel when they're sort of locked down to do these votes. And so also I have to think people, they're here for ultimately a spiritual purpose. Certainly there's a lot of politics, as we know, whether it's doctrinal politics or the politics of the larger world, impacting the cardinals and impacting what the church does, but ultimately they have to come open to the Holy Spirit, which is a very important part of Catholic thinking, Catholic theology. And so there is a more prayerful atmosphere, I can assume. But even in that, of course, people will be seeing what the votes are, who's getting more votes, who's getting fewer votes, and they will be praying about that quietly to themselves and thinking about the good of the church and who's the best person to lead the church forward. And so we'll wait. The world awaits expectantly. The stovepipe, the little chimney, has been put up a couple of days ago on the Sistine Chapel. There's a stove in the Sistine Chapel where the ballots will be burned after each ballot until we have a pope, when we have the 2/3 plus one majority for the election. And as we know, the world will be watching. Many people, of course, will be gathering every day in St. Peter's Square, and I'm sure television cameras will make sure that they're training their lenses on that stovepipe. And this is always one of the exciting things about the conclave, is that we'll see black smoke if there's no pope yet elected. So the ballot papers are mixed with a certain mix of chemicals, potassium and sulfur. And then if the pope is elected, we'll see the white smoke. And that, of course, is what everybody will be anticipating and excited to then find out who the pope is. And so the white smoke will be a sign that we have a pope, habemus papam, we have a new pope, and opens a new chapter in the church. And I would say, given the changes and continuities that are part and parcel of Catholicism, the next pope will also be someone who will keep to the core of what is the Catholic tradition, while also being sensitive to the many expectations and demands within the church and in terms of the geopolitical context that it has to navigate and provide moral leadership for. Thank you very much.